Welcome back. We're going to talk about globalization. This is a topic I think that increasingly is going to get less attention simply because 20 years ago the idea of globalization was new and now it's not. And we're going to prove that to you with some of these slides. Okay, let's take a test. Question 1. In what country is Nokia headquartered? Nokia, until recently, a leading cell phone manufacturer, has been in hard times for about the past 24 months or so due to its failure to innovate in smartphones. Where's it headquartered? Correct answer is Finland. How about the percentage of Coca-Cola's annual revenue that comes from outside of the United States? About 75% is the answer. Obviously varies year to year. Okay, let's talk about our friend the 787, the subject of your ST for the next class. About 800 sales, kind of goes up and down with cancellations. How many of US-based airlines bought for this US-based airplane manufacturer? Only about 100. Last question. InBev. Where's its headquartered? It owns the Icon Anheuser-Busch, headquartered in, we may have mentioned this in class earlier, Belgium. But that doesn't really do it justice to say it's headquartered in Belgium. It's true. It's actually a Brazilian-dominated company, and the Brazilian executives bought a Belgian beer company for a variety of reasons. They said the headquarters is in Belgium, and then they proceeded a few years later to buy Anheuser-Busch. So hopefully, no, there are no doubters out there that this is a global world. The graphic on the right just shows you that the population, there's a lot of population in the world besides your continent. So if you're only going to focus on your continent, you're leaving out a good chunk of folks. Fair enough, you kind of knew that. Let's take just a second, though, to recap what's really changed over the past 20 years that has made globalization explode. Going to give you a brief history lesson. First of all, remember that when I was a young man, just graduating from college, there was this other system called communism, with the Soviet Union being the other major superpower, which had a very definite economic system. Well, that changed in the late 80s and early 90s, and now pretty much all the world accepts that capitalism is the way to go. So chunks of area that were just virtually off limits for trading are now wide open. The next point is decreasing transportation costs. If you go back and pull the history on FedEx and UPS, they weren't flying nearly as many airplanes over the ocean 20 years ago as they are today. FedEx has only been around for about 35 years. UPS is older than that, but not in the transnational or transcontinental shipping business. And then a real growth in the international shipping fleets. So the costs have plummeted. No longer is it so cost prohibitive to move articles across oceans to get them to their markets. And then we've had decreasing communication costs. In the interest of time, I'll make it really, give you a really summary. I've lived in Japan multiple times. The first time in the early 90s, it cost about $1.25 a minute for us to call our family. We went back to that same spot 10 years later, and it cost 10 cents a minute for us to call our families. And then we moved back to Tokyo a few years after that, and it was down to 4.5 cents a minute for us to call. So from $1.25 in the early 1990s to the mid-2000s, 4.5 cents a minute. And of course, the internet has essentially made it free to transmit information. So all of those things enabled globalization. But one of the things that we want to understand is we talk as though it's a global world and everybody's selling everything everywhere, and it's not so. What you see among companies, even today, is they tend to operate in regions as opposed to truly worldwide. There aren't that many companies like Coca-Cola, like Nokia, that operate around the world. This is some staggering numbers. You can look at the pie chart. The pie chart on the left is imports in 1963. The one on the right is 2008, the latest year for which we were able to obtain complete data. What's striking is, yes, the the Asia segment's much bigger, powered largely by China. But what is so striking to me is look at the total volume of imports on the left. And I believe this is a constant year dollars. 164 billion. 2008, 16 trillion, 127 billion. That is a 100-fold expansion in the shipping of goods across borders. A lot of us don't realize that still the United States is the largest exporter in the world. A lot of that's agricultural products. A lot of that's also Boeing airplanes. But look at China. Literally, their number was 0 in the 1970s, and look where they are today. And of course, this number only in 2008, I'm sure, is up even beyond that. And then look at the difference between U.S. exports and imports. And I would suggest that poses a long-term structural issue for the United States, but that's more of an economics issue than a strategy issue. But I just wanted to show you those slides to reinforce how much the world has become a global world. So now you're ready to take your company global. These are the fundamental questions you're going to have to address. What markets are we going to enter? So that's the sold where. Using what product mix? And I'll give you some illustrations of how that becomes a factor. And where are we going to manufacture our goods? In the textbook, it talks about this arbitrage thing that you find the lowest cost manufacturer, and later it talks about the best manufacturer. Under what organization? Using what entry strategy? And then the composite of all those, what risks does that expose us to? These are the fundamental questions. The book has this interesting discussion of Porter's diamond. It's good and it's valid, but I think the single most important point to take away from it is, according to Porter's diamond, what does it say is the most important factor to determine whether a company is going to be able to compete globally? The book says it is the intensity of competition in their home market, which suggests that first you bulk up and you get strong and you get to be a good fighter in the home market before, or if you want to succeed on the global market. This is a nice chart out of another from another source that summarizes these fundamental questions and how firms attempt to answer these fundamental questions. And I'll walk through them piece by piece. I also want you to note that I'm going to use the BSG simulation to answer some of these questions. The textbook talks about an international strategy where there's low pressure for customization and low pressure for optimization. I just don't really think those markets exist in enough numbers to even discuss them. So then you get into this question of these fundamental questions of where are we going to market, what product are we going to market, and how are we going to manufacture it. The idea of a global strategy says one market for the world with one or maybe a few distribution points. The other extent of that is the multi-domestic strategy, which says you do extensive customization for each specific market. And so you have to really adapt to the local tastes. And there may not be a lot of integration. And then you get the Goldilocks land, which this one calls the transnational strategy. You got to read it. I don't have my glasses on. The transnational strategy, where it's a little bit of both. So we'll kind of define the poles and go from there. But let me ask you this. Using these definitions, what strategy do you use for your shoe manufacturer in the business strategy game? I'd argue that you are using a global strategy, because if you think about it, you don't tailor the shoes. You're not even really allowed to tailor the marketing approach. You're the big bad headquarters that makes all the decisions, and you sell your product worldwide, albeit with some tweaks in your level of advertising, those sorts of things in the different markets. So in BSG, you're in essence running a global strategy. Well, what's the strength of a global strategy? You can do things like have very optimized production facilities where you get really good at making your product because there's not a lot of variation. So you get standardization and those sorts of things. What are the limitations? What if people in China want a different running shoe than people in South Africa? Well, sorry, we give you our standard product. And then it says consolidation may end up in dependence on a single facility. Some of you are feeling, or well, everybody's feeling that pain in that you have two factories in two different parts of the world, but you have tariff issues, exchange rate issues, all of that, and you think, boy, it sure would be nice if I was able to sell, manufacture, and sell in each of my markets where I wasn't suffering these tariff issues and losses due to exchange rates. But let's take a step back. We'll talk about this in class, but the first question I'm going to ask you is, when does it make a lot of sense for a company to adamantly stick to a global strategy? There are specific cases where a global strategy makes the most sense. How about multi-domestic? Lots of firms do multi-domestic strategies where they do lots of local adaptations. Believe it or not, say in appliances, major worldwide appliance manufacturers, the refrigerators that you see from Samsung in the United States are not the same refrigerators that Samsung's producing for the Korean market, not the same refrigerators that Samsung is producing for the European market, because we build our kitchens differently, the power is different, people's expectations are different, people's shopping patterns are different, and that refrigerator design has to be adapted to each of those different markets. The problem with that is it can become expensive to do so. So then you get into this transnational strategy where you try to retain your economies of scale, but you do the adaptations where you must. And there's a lot of companies fit into this where they try to stick with their core product and just kind of tweak with it on the packaging or things like that. So you have issues like Facebook. Does Facebook operate the same in all markets in the world? Probably not. Probably, for example, and I don't know about Facebook, but I know MySpace before it became irrelevant. MySpace was being very careful, for example, in the Middle Eastern markets, such that if a person wanted to block it so that they could only see profiles of the same gender, they were able to do so, which is more common in the Islamic culture. Starbucks in China is another great example. What do you think Starbucks' leading selling product is in China? Coffee? No, it's tea. Starbucks had to adapt to that while trying to get people to become coffee drinkers. But if you're going to succeed in China as a beverage retailer, at least for now, tea is going to be your biggest product. So I want you, as we go through this, I want you to think about when does this make sense for which companies? And then we get the question of using what strategy. Okay, I'll let you take a minute, look at the slide, and tell me what entry strategy your company uses in BSG. Well, you're using an exporting strategy. You manufacture the shoes, but then you ship them worldwide to retailers who actually sell them, which means you're hostage to issues like, well, how many retailers are willing to stock my shoes because you don't have company stores. And I have to spend so much money on retailer support to keep them happy. And if they don't like my internet pricing, they stop carrying my shoe. And I have to pay tariffs into all these countries. And I have trouble managing my warehousing issues because I have to satisfy all these retailers. So those are some of the risks of exporting. Typically, what you surrender with exporting is you surrender control and how the product is executed in those foreign markets. And often you surrender some profits because you also surrender some risk. That's kind of nice. So the retailers take your shoes in, they sell them, or they don't, and they may have to eat the shoes they take and can't sell. They may have to mark them down after they've already paid you your price. Not too bad. Then you look at licensing and franchising. Licensing basically says you sell the technology to someone and they use it for their own purposes, much like a franchise. Franchising is very global. Go to Japan, for example, and you see 7-Elevens. How about all these hotel chains like Hilton and Marriott? Many of those are locally owned restaurants, or I'm sorry, hotels, that they're able to adapt a little bit, but also fit in with the global brand. So here, you've kept a little bit more control because the franchisee gets to set some limits. The licensee gets to set some limits. But you're taking some risks on them, and you've still lost some degree of control. Then you get into alliances and joint ventures, which are very popular now in the globalization realm. The idea here is that you get an experienced partner who knows the lay of the land. And then furthest up is the wholly owned subsidiary, which will often be referred to as a greenfield venture. Do we see companies doing this? Sure. Intel, for an example, is a company that tends to build factories all by themselves in the countries where they want to operate. Intel, for example, has plants in China, Vietnam, and the Philippines to do their chip making. There are reasons to do this. In class, we're going to talk about why might firms choose to execute wholly owned subsidiaries as their entry strategy, even though it is the highest risk for the company, because you can go in and you can get it very, very wrong. You can go in and be seen as a foreigner and not be received well. All of these are risks. So each of these entry strategies have pros and cons, and it's up to the company to decide what works best for their particular product. Let's talk about risks. Again, this is something that you're seeing in BSG. Mainly, you're seeing the risk of currency fluctuation. What I don't play in the game is I don't play that this particular region, because it wouldn't be by region, it would be by country, that a given country has executed some sort of legal change that really disadvantages companies. You see this a lot, for example, in Russia and China, where Western companies are disadvantaged and the rules of the game are not the same. Russia, for example, for a long time had a development program with BP in Eastern Russia. And basically, BP just got kind of run out of the deal because they couldn't get the political approvals and that sort of stuff. And ostensibly, it's not about you, BP. You got your good alliance partner, but it really was. So this is something you're going to have to weigh. Is it worth going in? Are the rules of the game such that I can succeed in this? And then there's just the risks that you're not going to get things right. Probably in your OB class, you went over the idea of Hofstede's cultural dimensions, but they're worth talking about. These are the way the Hofstede measure the difference between the cultures. It affects how you negotiate. It affects how you interact. If we were doing this in class, I would tell you some funny or maybe not so funny stories about some of my experiences negotiating in Asian cultures and the like. But these are all things that are very important. So let's look at this, say, the United States versus China. Individualism, high in the United States, much lower in China. So it gives you a different negotiating strategy, not so much the emphasis on the big player. And even lower on individualism than China is Japan. Very interesting culture to negotiate. Long-term orientation. Americans tend to have short long-term orientations. Chinese tend to have very long-term orientations, or longer term orientations, however the right way is to say that. Power distance. In the United States, somewhat an egalitarian culture. You go into most Asian cultures, big power distance between the two. Uncertainty avoidance, fairly low in the United States, fairly strong risk takers. My understanding is in China, they are also fairly big risk takers, which means they have low uncertainty avoidance. Japanese, for example, Masa may differ, but I would say fairly risk averse. And therefore they don't like the big risky deals as much. Masculinity, for example, United States, again, increasingly a more culture or a gender balanced society, not true in Asia. And then you have to look at not just the culture, but style, administrative style. Again, Americans tend to be fairly informal. Other cultures, it's all about the writing. Geographic differences, sometimes to the extent that the market you're going into has really significant geographic differences, you may have a hard time understanding the right way to do things. And likewise, in the economic systems, you may not understand how things do work or should work because you're not familiar with that system. Okay, that's our last slide. I've gone through it lickety-split because we'll have a chance to talk about this. You'll come in, merging this idea of globalization and alliances with our case study of the 787, but we're going to pick up several of these topics as we talk about it in class. Look forward to seeing you then.